Is this helpful for me to have this microphone?
Sure.
Does this make a difference at all? The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for Numbers, and we thank you that when we walk in our own wilderness, you are always there with us. Amen.
Amen.
Is this helpful to have these extra speakers?
Yeah.
Right here? Okay, great. It's really confusing. I'm hearing myself from my left ear. And it's throwing me off. Oh no, I think it does help. I was a little quiet last week, I think, and tonight is Ascension 101, and I don't want to wear my throat out because I'm doing tonight's confirmation class, so I don't want to finish my throat in 1 hour. So I'm really curious, as we kind of begin to walk through Numbers, who actually read those couple of chapters of Numbers?
Read or skimmed?
Who looked at it? So I think that was a good summary point of read or skimmed. I want to give you an encouragement. The book is known as Numbers because of the way it starts, which is with this boring census and lots of numbers. That is not the whole book. So this is just how it starts out. Most people are probably going to give up at this point. The rest of the book, it's going to have a lot of action, and it's a fun book, and there's a lot of humor in it. And so don't be disappointed just from the way that the book starts off. There is a lot of action that takes place, and it's not just numbers and strange names and things like that. So my encouragement to you is stick with it. So anything that stood out for you while you were reading this?
There were lots of names.
There were lots and lots of names. We will look at 2 of them that pop back up. Some of them are also special because they are symbolic names, especially when it names the leader of each clan or each tribe and who would lead them out. A lot of them are symbolic. Just one example is Eleazar or Eleazar, which is a name about God has helped or God is my rock. My nephew's name is Eleazar, so I like that name. There's a couple other symbolic names as well. Marcia?
Question. When Numbers was put down on paper, oops.
Yeah.
Okay. Before that happened, all of this was transmitted from one generation to another verbally. How the heck could they have done all of those names and who belongs to whom? And I mean, find 12 tribes, most anyone could get that.
Well,
But I mean, that's going down generations and.
that's a good question. I'm going to ask John a question. When you were in Africa, did you ever hear someone quote their ancestry?
Yeah.
How many generations back did they go?
20.
Yes. So it is in African tribes, they memorize the generations back 20 generations.
And they have stories that they remember too that are old.
Yeah. So not uncommon.
Yeah, they have oral books. That's their job, is to remember that.
I'm glad that you do that because that was the same thing when I was in East Africa. They would go 20 generations back and they could tell you everything. But a lot of these are based on oral stories. They're still being transmitted and written down. Yeah.
I read that they were unhappy with the food in the dream. And they had food, right?
Yeah, well that was
unhappy with what they had.
so I don't think we get to that part in this text today. But if you were in lectionary 2 weeks ago, it's from Numbers, I think it's 21, and the part with the bronze snakes, and they complain about not having food, and then they complain about the food that they have, which is a way of saying that this is a complaining people. And they're not just complaining about their situation, they're complaining about this new way of life with God. And so just as a reminder for what we want to remember about Numbers, it's rebellion in the wilderness. Because time and time again, we'll see that rebellion. And even that part where they're complaining about food and water and the other things they'll complain about, they're actually rejecting God and this covenant with God.
So that is symbolic of them complaining? Or?
It's like what they're actually complaining about isn't the main thing, which is true a lot of the times when we complain.
Something that really struck me was the minuscule detail that they went into when they're packing up the tent of meeting to go on the next phase of their journey. You know, you put this with a blue cloth over it, this gets a scarlet cloth, and then a covering of goat skin, and then placed upon the, I guess what.
It's almost as bad as our altar guild.
Evidently, somehow they are attributing some special virtue to this huge ritual.
Yes, very much so. And we are going to end talking about that and the importance, the sanctity of worship in the priestly class. And it's because God is special, and these things are houses for God. And so the tabernacle is not just a church. It's not just where people meet. It's where God meets. So that we call it the tent of meeting because that's where people meet God. And so that's why it becomes so important. Becky, did you?
So I was just going to say, what that struck me too was the colors, and I was going to ask, is that really where we begin to get our altar colors?
You know, I don't think our altar colors are based on this, because our vestments are based on the liturgical colors.
Yeah.
So green's the color for the Holy Spirit, because it's like the Spirit's life and like plants. Red is the color for Pentecost, which is like the fire. White is for like celebration times. It's pure like Christ.
I guess I was thinking more generally the whole concept of having different colors and different.
It might be rooted in that. And, you know, especially back then, there's limited ways that you're able to kind of commemorate something as a different color, and colored fabrics are expensive. And so to spend so much investment on this is showing its importance. Somebody looked at with just how much ridiculous amounts of gold, or bronze and silver. I mean, it's just an unfathomable amount. That's because it's important. Any other questions or thoughts from this? Boring reading, but there is some excitement in there. Before we kind of start walking your way through the text, I just want to look at our coming up. So today we are covering chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 20. And then next time that we meet will be April 11th. We will not meet the next 2 weeks because of Holy Week and the church is closed after Easter. But we will look at the rest of chapter 4 through chapter 7. And then April 18th, we will look at chapters 8 through 12. That is the plan. I don't think we're going to combine these. But this morning I was contemplating combining these other two, but I don't think we will. I will let you know in the next 2 weeks, though. And just to look at our map, here's where we are. So we started, remember, way back up here in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. We had traveled, and we are still at Mount Sinai. And we are getting ready to leave Mount Sinai, but that's still where we are. And in our timeline of things that have happened, the Exodus was 1 year ago. Or sorry, it was 1 month ago. And so we are now in the second month. And so it's been 1 month since the Exodus. By the end of this book, we have ran through 40 years. So there is a lot of movement that's going to happen. And just as a reminder for the book of Numbers, so what we want to remember is its rebellion in the wilderness. Our Hebrew name for Numbers means in the desert or in the wilderness. I like that as a name a lot more. I think that captures more what this book is about. This is the bridge from we built the tabernacle and learned how to worship in Exodus and Leviticus. And we're about to go in the promised land in Joshua and through the Judges. But how do we get there? And that's what this book is about. It's that trip in the wilderness. And it's about the people testing their relationship with God. The one reminder is this book covers 2 generations. So there's this first census that's taken. But because these people question God so much, this whole generation dies off, except 2 of them. We'll get to them. And at the end of the book of Numbers, there's a second census that's taken. And then we'll follow kind of their, as they start to move closer into the promised land. And it happens in three different places. And so it starts off in Sinai, then it goes to the wilderness of Haran, and then the wilderness of Edom. I wanted to check. I was trying to print this chart out before I came down here, and the printer didn't like me. Does everyone have this chart that we printed out for Numbers? Because if not, I will try again to get it printed afterwards. And we'll,
I don't think we had enough the first time.
do we not have enough? Okay.
I wouldn't print out a bunch
If
of
you
them, but-
if you don't have them, catch me after, and we'll try to get the printer to like us a little bit. And this is our outline for where we'll be looking at the whole book. So it's 3 sections. There's the part that happens in the wilderness of Sinai, the wilderness of Paran, and the wilderness of Moab. And so that's the breakup and how we're going to read the book. But today, we're just in the first 4 chapters. So in chapter 1, we're going to read this very beautiful and long census of warriors with lots of different numbers, and it's really exciting. In chapter 2, we are going to look at the way that the camp was arranged, and then how they would organize, how they would march out. And so as they're moving through the wilderness, there was a rhythmic way that they would set up the tent of meeting, surround it, and then the way that they would march out and what direction they would go. Chapter 3 is going to be looking at the Levites. And chapter 4 is going to go into more detail. So there are subclasses of the Levites, and one of those is the Kohites, and we're going to look at them today. And for those that were with us last week, we looked at the 12 tribes of Israel, and I just want to name them again because it's relevant to what we're looking at today. So there was 12 sons to Jacob, who's later named Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Joseph is not a tribe. He gets 2 tribes from him, from 2 of his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then if you're good with math, you'll go, hey, if you turn 1 into 2, now you have 13. I thought there was 12 tribes. Well, that's because Levi doesn't really count as a tribe, so it doesn't get a land inheritance. And so the 12 tribes are all of those plus Ephraim and Manasseh. And sometimes in other parts of the Bible, there's extra tribes or clans that get mentioned, but usually this is how we talk about them. And that gets us into Numbers chapter 1. So this starts off where Yahweh commands Moses to take a census. And we talked about this when we started Numbers, but what's really special about this opening line is that God is talking to Moses in the tent of meeting. And in the book of of Leviticus, it starts off where God is talking to Moses from within the tent, and Moses is outside the tent. And so this is a change, and it's because Leviticus has happened. They know how to worship God. They know how to be ritually pure or ritually clean. And so now Moses is in the tent, which represents all of Israel, is now in communion with God, which is kind of what this whole thing is about, is getting close to God. And so in verses 4 through 16, there is an appointment of leaders for the census. And this part's going to get a little bit boring when you're reading through this. And it goes through how they are going to register all of the tribes and by clan. And then the chapter ends with the Levites are exempt from that census. And I put a chart up here that gives the numbers when you read it for all of the different tribes. Which ones do you notice as being the biggest? Judah and what else? And which ones are the smallest? Yeah, Manasseh. And, we don't get there yet, but there's a second census that's taken, and Simeon and Reuben both shrink. They get a lot smaller. That's at the end of the book. I just want to point that out. Notice that Judah is the strongest here and is the most numerous. That becomes important is Judah is the tribe of David, the one that the kings come from, and then we call them Jews because they're from Judah. And we already noticed here that they're a very big and strong tribe. Pay attention to that part. When you add up all of these, you get to 603,550, which is a really big number. And we're going to come back to that number in just a second. I want to look at just the layout of these because I think it might be kind of fun. So Judah is down here, and this makes up the southern kingdom later with King David. And kind of around Judah, you also have Reuben and Simeon, and you have Benjamin and Dan are kind of centered in that south part. That correlates to a lot of the big, strong, powerful tribes are all down in the south. I just want to point that out because if you were here last week and we talked about which tribes were more important, we're learning already in the census Judah is important. And so we're going to keep seeing that as we kind of walk through it. Here's a picture layout of kind of what that would look like. It's a lot of people, and you'll see the number on top is the Levites, and they're not counted in this first census, but they are in the next couple of chapters. So there's 600,000 men, and that is who would be there for a draft. So it's 20 years and older, those who could kind of fight in the military. And that's a big number. And we're going to talk about that because one of the things that we mentioned in here is if you add up so if there's 600,000 men of fighting age, that would be over 2 million people that would make up all of the tribes of Israel. And one of the things that's kind of funny about that number is that's more than all of the population of Palestine and Egypt at this time. And so there's a couple of things that we could look at those numbers. So one of them is we could say that these are literal numbers from a literal time in history, and we just didn't know how to do archaeology very well. Some Bible scholars will look at these numbers and say that they're symbolic, but we have just lost the symbolism of what they mean, because there doesn't seem to be any rhythm with these numbers, which is kind of strange. A lot of times in the Bible, when there's numbers, they mean something, like ages, and we don't know what these numbers mean. And some speculate that it's because it was based on a base 60 or a base 12 system that we don't use anymore. Like
The
maybe
Sumerians used that. That was what the Sumerians used.
Yeah, Babylonians used a base 60 based on their body parts. And so we know that. And we know that we used to use base 12. That's why we have 12 hours in a day and things like that. But we can't figure out what any of these numbers mean, which is kind of annoying for me, because when I see numbers, I like to add up and figure out what they mean. Another speculation, and I'm going to offer this to you if you kind of like to take the Bible quite literally, is that all of these numbers are a mistranslation given in chapter 1, and that it could have been like either a rabbinical error, so as they were copying the numbers down through the generations, or as they went through that oral tradition, they kept getting the wrong numbers, and that's what happened. Or this other idea is that when it reads out, it says there was this many thousand and this many hundred, is how we read it in our English Bibles. And one scholar speculates that instead of reading it as thousands and as hundreds, we could actually read it as clans and as warriors. I'll give an example of that. And I think this is cool. This is why I'm sharing this part. So it's the descendants of Judah, their lineage and their clans by their ancestral houses, according to the number of names, from 20 years and up, everyone able to go to war, those enrolled in the tribe of Judah were 74,600. The words that are there used as thousand and hundred can be translated differently, and they're oftentimes translated as clans and as warriors or groups. And so if you read it this way, it would be like the tribe of Judah has 74 clans, which means 600 warriors. And so if you're one who likes to kind of take Bible numbers literally, here's an alternative chart, and it would equal that all of Israel would have about 5,500 men of fighting age. And this number would actually match really, really well to this area. So around the period of the Judges, so this is still a few hundred years from this point, there's around 40 to 60,000 people living in the area of Canaan and Palestine and the Philistines, most of them concentrated on the coast. And if you're really into that, I have a whole article printout that for some reason printed on cardstock because the printer didn't like me today. And so this is, you can frame it and put it up on your wall, and it has all this really cool information about it. But I'll just say is, when you read Numbers 1, there's a couple of things that are really off. So first is just the number of the firstborn sons doesn't actually match the numbers of all the people. And because of that, one of the Jewish rabbis in the Midrash speculates that all Jewish women for their first birth would have 6 sons. Born at once. And that's how you get some of this number. This is not a joke. It's actually in the Jewish commentary. The population, it doesn't match. So I think that's kind of a cool idea to think about it like this. If you're one who really likes to take numbers really seriously, is instead of reading it as, so not 460, or 46,000, is that there's 46 tribes or clans, and that would mean about 500 men. So there you go. If you like numbers, you're welcome, I guess, or not. Okay, that's chapter 1. Any questions about that census? I know that's maybe not the most exciting stuff to look at.
But evidently, the relative numbers are what we really, like Judah has so many more than the,
Oh, yes, yeah.
so the relative numbers are important. You know it wasn't 600 some odd thousand men, and then you had women and children, be a couple million, because it would not have possibly had the resources to.
That would seem a stretch. Though it does fulfill, and I'm glad you actually just brought it up, it does fulfill this prophecy back to Abraham about this people that God is making in Abraham being a numberless people. And so we don't want to forget that part too. These really large and exaggerated numbers is like, what it's saying in Numbers is this is the most powerful nation in all the land. Though, when you get to the next book, it says they were the least numerous in the land, and they were smaller. So, take it for what it is. Okay, as we get to chapter 2, we're going to look at the way they arranged their camp. This is the picture. Ooh, that's blurry. It's this picture back here. But I wanted to show you the full blurry size of it. So right over here is the tent of meeting, or that tabernacle. Surrounding it is the tribes. I have another picture that's less blurry. And then these are the Levi clans, and then these are the tribes of Israel. And chapter 2 lays out the way that they're arranged like this. Kind of roughly how it branches out is it starts with Judah. And the red stars are the leaders of that section. So they do 3 on each side. So it starts with Judah, and they are the leader of this section. So they were the first to march, and they would lead the march. And they would go counterclockwise as they kind of work their way around. And so Reuben would lead the side of the south, Ephraim would lead the side of the west, and then Dan would lead that side of the north. And then in the middle of the camp was all of the Levites would surround the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle. And there are some different types of Levites that we'll get to a little bit later. But that's pretty much chapter 2, is right on this slide. You can fit it all right there. And this just goes through the way that they would march out and everything. Are there questions on that?
I have a question.
Oh, no. Okay.
It kind of goes back to the previous, who were their perceived enemies? I mean, obviously they spent a lot of time, finding people who were warriors or whatever.
At this point in the desert, there's not many people around because they're out in the wilderness where there's no infrastructure to uphold a population. As they get closer, let's go back to our map. So as they come up closer through here, this is when they start to run into people. And so surrounding all of the promised land, so you have the Edomites and the Moabites, and I forget exactly the people that are kind of living through here, but this is when they start to run into the enemies. And as they come up through Canaan, so they're going to work their way up and then kind of back down through the top of it. It's just filled with people because Canaan had a pretty high concentration of people, especially as you get closer to the sea, is where the Philistines or the sea people live. There's a lot of people there. So right now, not many people. As you go up there, lots of people. Any other questions about that, in the way it's arranged? Yeah.
I think I read that the area around all of the tabernacle and all of the people is 12 miles.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I have not.
So that's a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, if you have 2 million people, that's quite a bit. Okay, one part I do want to mention here in chapter 2, besides just the way everything is laid out, is there's 2 or 3 names that pop up again and are good names to hold on to. So in the tribe of Judah, you have this guy. And he becomes special because he notably makes the first offering in the dedication of the altar in Numbers chapter 7. And this part's also cool, is that this is the lineage through which we would track Jesus as being connected to the tribe of Judah. So of the names mentioned in chapter 2, that one's special. Also, you have Caleb and Joshua. So there's two leaders. They are the only ones from the first generation that will survive into the second generation and then go into the promised land. So later, when we get into the book of Numbers, they're going to send 12 spies into the promised land to see if they should enter. And 10 of the spies come back and say no, because there's giants and it's scary and we won't make it. But these two stay faithful to God's command and say, yeah, we can do this. God told us, let's go. And everyone else says no. And so their kind of blessing is that they get to live for that next 40 years and go through the promised land. We're getting new cabinets installed in the sacristy, and I think that might be it, which is great because they've been missing since last week. Wow, that's loud. Is that coming from the ceiling or is it coming from out the door?
Sounds like it's coming from
I don't know if closing the door will make a difference with that. Okay. That's the only names, and that's really all in chapter 2 that really stood out to me, unless someone else had another part that felt meaningful to them. Okay, let's move to chapter 3. And so now we're going to look at the census and the duties of the Levites. And so, as a reminder, this is what the high priest would wear. I couldn't find a good picture, so I just reused this one. And the parts that we're going to look at here in chapter 3, so we're going to look at the sons of Aaron, the duties of the Levites. And then there's this really long, or not long, but meaningful section about how the Levites are going to serve as substitutes for the firstborn. And we'll come back to that in a second when we get there. And then they're going to go through a census of all the different Levite families. And we're going to talk again about that substitute and redemption of the firstborn. I brought this chart here in case anyone's interested in family trees. I'll lay this in front of me because I also put the same thing up here. But Levi was one of those 12 sons of Jacob. And this is where the priests come from Levi. But not all of Levi's children become the priest. So the genealogy is that it comes to Aaron, and then Aaron's sons become the priest, except the other ones that don't, because there's also some priests that come from this place over here. And then Aaron has 4 sons. So there's Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and then Ithmar, however you say that name. But Nadab and Abihu are the 2 oldest sons. And I don't know if you remember way back in the book of Leviticus, but they make that. Remember it talked about how they would make the incense blend and how it was this sacred, sweet, smell to the Lord. And they go and make a different incense blend. And because of making that different incense blend, they die in the tabernacle. And we get this reminder that the Levites seem to kind of have it made. So if you're in any of the other tribes, you're kind of conscripted for war, which, if that was me, I wouldn't make it very long. So that's a scary spot to be in. But the Levites, they're all, not only on the inside of the camp, but they get the job of dealing with the tabernacle and studying and kind of the fun jobs, or at least what I would think would be a fun job. But they're not like royalty. So they are in a sacred place, which means they have a lot more responsibility. And this gives an example of this. The Levites aren't just elevated and better than everyone else. They are set aside for a sacred duty. And if they break that duty, there's serious consequences. And you see that with Aaron's 2 firstborn sons. There's no clearer picture of how important that their role is. And as we kind of look through, so there's the listing of all the sons. And then we get to the duty of the Levites. And so God here designates the tribe of Levi to serve in that priestly duty of being the ones that kind of attend to the tabernacle and the things in the tabernacle. So they're both the ones that are picking it up and reconstructing it. They're the ones doing the sacrifices, keeping all the utensils in working order, keeping everything clean and all of that. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And then there's this kind of strange part, and we'll get to it in a little bit more detail on the next slide, or in a couple of slides. but that the Levites are going to serve as substitutes for the firstborn. So way back in the book of Exodus, when the Passover happens, if you remember, God spares all the firstborns. And then after that, a way of commemorating that feast is that all of Israel was to dedicate the firstborn of animals and of people to be in service of the Lord. So either as a priest or as an offering. But here in Numbers, God dictates that the Levites will serve as a substitute for all of those firstborns. And we're going to get more detail in that at the end of that chapter. It brings up two questions. Do the firstborn still serve as priests? Because in other parts of the Bible, they do, though it seems like here they don't. And another question is, are all the Levi's priests or just Aaron's sons? And again, you have more than one answer to that. So it just depends on the time and history and the place. Here's a more detailed chart of the Levi family tree. You'll notice that there are other kind of clans that come from the Levites, and it's not the most important, but sometimes when you're reading through Scripture, or you might be reading in the Psalms, and you'll see like the sons of Korah or the sons of Asaph. Sometimes these are these other clans of priests that aren't the ones working in the temple, because Aaron's sons were like the special temple workers. Yeah.
I just got a tangential comment on this firstborn bill. In today's culture, if your mother is Jewish,
Oh, yeah.
you're Jewish, right?
Mm-hmm.
No reference to the father being a firstborn or 10th born. But back then, evidently the symbolism of the firstborn is extremely important. And maybe that's just to organize and identify people, but it just seems like there's this unusual affinity to the firstborn. But the firstborn is a bad guy, right? And so we go to the secondborn and thirdborn.
That is true, actually, so there is like a cultural preference to the firstborn or the first fruits of a garden as kind of being the best. What's interesting when you get to the patriarchs, it's never the firstborn, it's always the secondborn, or the younger that rises above. But there is this idea, so in the naming of the firstborn as belonging to God, it's a way of saying everything belongs to God. And so the firstborn is representing everyone. And now the Levites are stepping into that place.
That's a good answer, Mike.
Here is the rest of in chapter 13. It names some of the other clans for the Levites. So there's the Gershonites, the Kohites, and the Merites, and they all do different things. They all have different roles that they are to attend to. But there's also this special attention to Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons. And Moses is from the tribe of Levi, so he and Aaron are brothers. Aaron is the firstborn. He's the oldest brother. And the special priestly duty passes through them. Moses' ministry is limited in that it's not, it doesn't go to any of his children. It's just Moses. Whereas Aaron's priestly ministry kind of passes through all of them. And the total count of the Levites being 1 month, at least 1 month old and older, is 22,000. So they are a little bit smaller than the other tribes. But yeah.
Doesn't that seem like a lot of people to do those duties?
It does. All of these seem like a lot of people. But there's like, one thing to keep in mind too is that like this is written way back in Babylon times. And so like they're writing about the tent of meeting and all of that from the past, but what they're really writing about is the temple they're getting ready to build. And so they're drawing attention to they're rebuilding their own temple. Like they're going through their own exodus and back to the promised land when they're writing all of this. And so it's kind of writing to their own future and what's important. The chapter 3 ends with this part of the redemption of the firstborn. So back to that Exodus with the Passover where all the firstborn sons and the animals are kind of dedicated to God. Now the Levites are to assume that role. And so anytime there was a firstborn, they would be redeemed by a Levite to be in service to the Lord. But if there were extra, maybe there weren't enough Levites to take the place of all the firstborn sons, they would pay 5 shekels for the extras. And that's what that part was about. And one question I had was, well, what if they, could a firstborn still be what if they didn't want to redeem him? What if they wanted him to be a priest? An unconclusive answer. Because in different parts, it's sometimes, and so, yeah, sometimes the firstborn would still be serving as a priest, other times not. So, yeah.
What does it mean that they serve as substitutes for?
So back in Exodus, there was this extending statute that all firstborns forever and always would be in service to the Lord. So essentially they would be a priest. And so that firstborn was serving as substitute for all of Israel. Because all of Israel is to be a priest and serve the Lord. But then it was just the firstborns. And now the Levites are taking the place of the firstborn, where they would be redeemed and serve in that place. One way of thinking about this is it's like an elevation of a professional priestly class. And so it's like we're writing about the evolution of having priest as a profession, sort of thing. But it is confusing. And then that gets us to chapter 4. So this is the Kohathite duties. That slide's not supposed to be there. Don't look at that. So this is how the first 4 verses in chapter 4 start. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Take a census of the Kohathites, separate them from the other Levites by their clans and their ancestral houses, for 30 years old up to 50 years old, all who qualified to do work relating to the tent of meeting. The service of the Kohathites relating to the tent of meeting concerns the most holy things." That is how all of this reads. It is very detailed. And kind of a summary of this is, so all of the Kohathites, so they're a subclass or a clan of the Levites, are going to serve in a special service for the tabernacle. Their main duty has to do with attending to the sacred objects and the transportation of the covenant. And again, this sounds like it's an elevated position, but it actually comes with more serious stipulations. And so the section that we end with is this warning about how important this is so that they don't die in the service. Because they are the ones going inside the tabernacle, inside the tent of meeting, to the most holy place. Which, if you remember in Exodus, we talked about how the high priest would go there once a year. And there's kind of this myth that grew around that tradition where they would tie a rope around the high priest just in case he died inside, they could pull him out. And these guys' job is to go in there every time they move and gather up all of these most sacred items. And so that's kind of, they have a special job, but it's a serious job.
Priests now have ropes around their waist?
I think that's why they have the really long cincture things, so we can pull them out. This is a short glance of what happens in the first 4. There's not a lot of substance here. When I looked at this, I was like, I'm ready to really learn some really devotional parts. And it's kind of hard to find in here. But one thing I want to have as a reminder for us as we're reading in Numbers, so not only is more action will come when we get there, but this starts off laying out this census, and it lays out the structure for the people of Israel. And we're continuing to lay out the structure for the way that they worship God and how that is conducted. And the reason there's such importance on that, like we always say, it's because the way we worship God is important, and that we worship God is important. And so it adds all of this order and all of this structure. But that order and that structure is kind of focused on the Levites, on this priestly class. And so I'm going to play a video from the Bible Project on kind of the importance of priests. And it's going to go back to the garden. And it's a short video. It's only about 5 minutes. But it's going to kind of carry us forward into why priests are important and then how that relates to Jesus. For those that were here last week, when we looked at the 12 tribes of Israel, we mentioned how there are 2 genealogies of Jesus in the Bible. There's one in Matthew and one in Luke. And the one in Matthew connects Jesus to the tribe of Judah through David as a king. And throughout the scriptures, there's this promise of this coming king that's going to come, who's going to reign and rule. But in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has this genealogy connection to the tribe of Levi. And so Jesus is special because he is both king and priest. And so this series that they have is called the Royal Priest, because he's king and priest. And we're seeing that connection here. And so when we're reading about all of these priestly things, we can think none of this matters anymore, but it actually does. It matters in two ways. One, it matters because of Jesus is coming as a priest and representing that connection to God. But it also matters is because we as Christians are called to be a priest. And that same order is Jesus. And so my devotional encouragement for you is remember that priests are important because Jesus is a priest and we're called to be priests as well. And hope you don't go anywhere sacred and die, I guess. Now, is that just me or is there no sound?
You have the sound on the TV on?
I do, yeah. I'll play it for you.
They're supposed to partner with God. The story of the Bible begins
Can you hear this?
in a garden temple with a couple, Adam and Eve, as God's royal priests. They're supposed to partner with God to take care of creation, and this place where heaven and earth are one is filled with God's blessing. But Adam and Eve were led astray by a deceptive creature and exiled from God's presence. Their vocation as priests is lost, and with that, all humanity descends into violence. But God promises that a new royal priest will come to lead them back into the blessing of Eden by sacrificing himself. So later on, we meet a new couple, Abraham and Sarah. God promises that through their family, the royal priest will come to restore the Eden blessing, not just for them, but for all the nations. And so it's this family that grows to become the Israelites. And they eventually journey to Egypt and then become enslaved under the violent rule of King Pharaoh. So God appoints a man named Moses to represent him to Pharaoh and to mediate on Israel's behalf. Moses confronts Pharaoh and then leads Israel out of slavery into the wilderness, where they eventually come to Mount Sinai. And here, God appears to all the Israelites, inviting them to become a kingdom of priests. So he's inviting everyone to be priests, like Adam and Eve were priests in Eden. Right. But it turns out the people are afraid of God, and they don't want to come close to God's presence, and so Moses goes alone up to the top of the mountain. And up there, Moses famously gets the 10 Commandments. The first two being, worship Yahweh alone, and don't make idol statues. And Moses sees some really amazing things up there. First, he sees God's heavenly temple, and then also a blueprint of it, called the pattern. All right, the plans for the construction of the tabernacle. Yeah, it's designed as a symbolic model of Eden, a place where heaven and earth are one. Then Moses sees something else, the pattern of a glorious human figure. The high priest who will work in the tabernacle. Right, and only this priest can go in and out of the sacred space on behalf of others. He's dressed in white, he wears a crown and is glowing with jewels. He's an image of the royal priest that we're waiting for. And yet, the man who's called to be Israel's first high priest is the brother of Moses, a man named Aaron. And while Moses is up seeing all of this, down at the foot of the mountain, Aaron is misleading the people by making an idol statue of God. So the soon-to-be high priest is breaking the first of the 10 Commandments. Yes. And so God gets angry, and he tells Moses that he's done with these people. They'll just start over with Moses. But Moses stands before God, and he intercedes for the Israelites. He even offers his own life as a sacrifice for their sins. And while God doesn't take Moses' life, he does forgive the people like Moses asked. And so when Moses comes down from the mountain, he's shining. Just like the high priest that he saw in his vision. It's like he's the real priest that his brother was supposed to be, but failed. And from here, the tabernacle is built. And then Aaron's family is installed to the priesthood. But really, even after this bad start? Yeah, and actually things get even worse. God gives Aaron and his sons really precise instructions on how to act as the priests. And then on their first day on the job, Aaron's two sons violate God's commands. And because they're in a place of great privilege and responsibility, God deals severely.
They die inside the tabernacle. Things are not looking good for the priesthood of Aaron.
Right, both Aaron and his sons have failed in their priestly role. And this begins to make us think maybe God's people need a different kind of priesthood.
Maybe one that's more like Moses, who surrendered his very life over to God.
Yes, and while Moses is great, he also fails to be fully obedient to God. And so both he and Aaron die outside the land promised to Abraham.
So Moses was only an image of the kind of priest that God's people will need.
Right, we're still waiting for this ultimate royal priest who will intercede like Moses and offer his life for the failures of others.
The Israelites eventually make it into the promised land, and there they appoint a king and establish a kingdom. Perhaps now God's royal priest can arrive.
And this brings us to King David, and his story is what we're going to look at next.
So this is a good series of videos about, it's the royal priest, if you look it up, about the history of the priest and then how that leads up to Jesus. But my encouragement for us, and for myself too, is the priests matter because it leads to Jesus and that leads to us. And that takes us to where we will look at in the weeks to come. So we will not meet for the next 2 weeks because of Easter, but then we will work our way through on April 11th, the rest of chapter 4 through chapter 7. And possibly we will combine these 2 weeks and look at the next couple of chapters. It just depends on how much content is in there. And as a reminder, if anyone needs this chart, let me know because we will make copies. But there's our short look at first 4 chapters.
Alexander?
Yeah.
Are Jewish priests now, do they have to be descended from Levi?
I don't think Jews have priests anymore. They have rabbis.
Rabbis, sorry.
No, so that's a little different. So, let me come back to this little, so for those that are curious about this, so later as you go through kind of the Hebrew Bible, there becomes divisions on who is the real priest or not, and which kind of class of priest. And so when we get to kind of the time of Jesus, there is I guess you would just say a political conflict of which priests are the ruling priests. So it's the I can't exactly remember which son that they come through, but the Sadducees, like when we read about them, are those that are kind of ruling over not the Sadducees, those that are ruling over the temple at the time of Jesus and that high priest. They're from a different school of priests, and those two groups of priests were in conflict. But that was one subsection of Second Temple Judaism, the priestly class. The other class was the Pharisaical Judaism, and that kind of grew when there was no temple. So it didn't matter if you had a priest or not, because there was no temple to go to. And so they would just look at the text and try to study through the text. And you had other divisions as well. But Pharisaical Judaism is the only one that survived in the temple destruction in 70 AD. And so out of Pharisaical Judaism grew Rabbinic Judaism, which is what we have today. It also has a bunch of different classes, but it has nothing really to do with priests. It has to do with like studying the text and their commentaries on the text and everything like that.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Any other questions? I have no more PowerPoint. It's a great time for questions.
I find it interesting that, and it may be somewhere, that there are no clearly defined criteria to be a priest, other than your lineage.
Oh, yeah.
Because, for example, in modern times, a Benedictine and most of your Catholic priests are expected to take vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Mm-hmm. And there are probably others too, but those are the 3 cornerstones. That doesn't seem to be mentioned anywhere yet.
Yeah. Well, so I think one thing to keep in mind, there is other subclasses in Jewish society that people would take special vows to, like a Nazirite vow. So the way that we remembered it in school is no booze, no bick, and no body. So they didn't drink alcohol, they didn't cut their hair or shave, and they couldn't touch a dead body. And so those are ones that would take they would have a special vow that they would take. There was another subclass of Jews called the Essenes. They're kind of like John the Baptist. You can think of them kind of like the Amish. So their kind of focus was on the way that you live out the way of living God's life. And so they saw the evil as being in the city, and so they moved out of the city, out to the wilderness. And they would often do baptisms of repentance, kind of like John the Baptist, and they might eat funny food because they don't eat city food. And so they would eat honey locust, which is a plant in the desert. But one thing to keep in mind is in the biblical narrative, oftentimes God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And I think that's actually something that's beautiful because it's less like you need to be this for you to do my work. God says, I can use anyone. And so for the Levites, anyone is born into that work. And now for all of us, God can use anyone. It doesn't matter what you've done or who you are. You can just come. Ooh, I keep messing up this mic. But that is a different distinction. Yeah. I'm kind of glad that it's not dependent on who you were born to be. Any other questions? Peace and blessings.
Whoa, thank you.
It's the shortest PowerPoint I think we've ever had. Oh my, that was